Hello students, after studying this module, you shall be able to learn why the aggregate supply denoted as AS has a positive slope. You would also know the difference between the Keynesian and classical aggregate supply. Also understand the difference between SRAS, that is short run aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply. You would also understand what causes a shift in the aggregate supply. Begin by aggregate supply. In aggregate supply, we can see that an economy's equilibrium output and price level is jointly determined by the forces of demand and supply. The aggregate supply, or AS, describes the amount of output firms plan to supply at each level of prices. Since firms would like to sell more output as product price increases, the AS typically slopes upwards. In microeconomics, the firm's aggregate supply curve is upward sloping for the same reason, with the underlying assumption that input prices remain constant. However, when we are looking at aggregate economy, it is quite possible that when the price level is increasing, prices of inputs also increase alongside, which increases the cost of production for the firms. If increase in price of inputs lag behind the increase in the product prices, the firms will have an incentive to produce and sell more. However, if input prices rise in the same proportion as that of product prices, firms will not be induced to produce more and real output will not increase with an increase in price level. Consequently, the aggregate supply curve would be a vertical line, which we would show immediately in a diagram. This corresponds to long run case of the classical model. Therefore, it is important to make a distinction between long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve, or AS. So, with an upward sloping AS, as the shifts in aggregate demand AD give rise to business cycles, you will learn more about AD curve in our next module. Then you will find that when the AD shifts upwards due to expansionary monetary or fiscal policies, the economy experiences a boom. Alternatively, when the AD shifts downwards due to contractionary policies, the economy plunges into a recession. In this context, you will see from our discussion in this module that the shape of the AS curve is of great significance. In this module, we shall therefore learn about the derivation of the AS curve and the causes of the shift in the AS and the difference between the short run and the long run aggregate supply curve. So, let us now try to learn about the derivation of the aggregate supply curve. How do we derive this curve? The AS curve shows the relationship between the price level P and the output Y for a given value of expected price, which is denoted as PE or P raised power E, but we will call it as PE. It is positively sloped in the short run. The equation for the aggregate supply curve then can be written as Y is equal to Yn plus beta P minus PE, where beta is greater than 0. So, in this equation, Y is the level of output, Yn is the output at natural rate, and P and PE are the actual and the expected level of prices respectively. Beta in this case measures the responsiveness of output to unexpected changes in the price level. Hence, 1 upon beta measure the slope of the aggregate supply curve, AS curve. The equation shows that when actual price is not equal to expected price, the output deviates from the natural level of output. In other words, at the long run equilibrium, when output is equal to the natural level, actual price is equal to expected price. In figure, we would show that y is depicted on the horizontal axis and p is depicted on the vertical axis. In the short run, with the given level of expected price, an increase in p causes y to increase by more than natural rate. And if p is lower than pe, y will be less than the natural rate. And if p is equal to pe, y will be at the natural rate, which depicts the long run situation. So if pe increases, the aggregate supply curve shifts upward. So you can see very clearly in the diagram that how we have shown this kind of a relationship. We have output on the x-axis, price level on the y-axis, and AS curve is upward sloping. The presence of some market imperfections will help us understand why AS has a positive slope in the short run. In other words, the presence of some specific types of friction will explain how unexpected movements in the price level are associated with the deviation of output from the natural rate. There are some models explaining these frictions. We will study some of them. The first model we are going to discuss is sticky nominal wages model. Nominal wages are sticky as these are set by long-term contracts between firms and workers and hence cannot be changed in response to changes in demand. In the absence of contracts, nominal wages are sticky when firms and workers get into implicit agreements or social norms and notions of fairness prevent wages to be cut a certain level. Both workers and firms are concerned about real wages and therefore labor demand and labor supply are both functions of the real wage. When contracts are negotiated in nominal terms, the actual price level is known. So nominal wages are set using expected prices PE. Suppose soon after setting the contract, the firms learn that the price level P has increased unexpectedly in response to an increase in aggregate demand. It implies that P is now greater than the expected price level PE. With the nominal wage fixed, the real wage falls, which increases the firm's demand for labor, as labor demand is a function of real wage. This will result in more production and a deviation of the output from the natural rate. The figure explains this process. We would explain this figure in detail. An increase in actual price from P1 to P2 lowers W by P, which increases the demand for labor from L1 to L2. More labor produces more output, increasing it from Y1 to Y2 as shown in the production function. So effectively, an increase in price level increases the output, which causes AS to slope upwards, which is very clear from this diagram that how the AS curve is upward sloping in our diagram. You can have a close look at these three segments of our diagram. This is our sticky wage model. So even when nominal wages are flexible, the short-run deviations in output can arise because workers temporarily confuse between real and nominal wages as they cannot perceive and process all available information correctly. I am sure you understand this clearly. So if there is a sudden increase in the price level, which workers are unaware of, but firms can correctly observe, it tends to increase labor supply and therefore output. Now to make matters clear, let us say that both workers and firms care about real wages, which is reflective of the real world. After all, a person does not simply care about how much money, which is nominal wages, he earns, but also about quantity of goods he can buy with that money. Therefore, labor demand and labor supply are both functions of real wage, which means the real wage increases, the demand for labor falls, and the supply of labor is directly related to the real wage. And therefore, as real wage increases, the supply of labor in general increases. The intersection of this labor demand and labor supply basically determines the equilibrium level of employment and output. However, we assume that firms have all information and labor demand is a function of real wage, which can be written as LD as a function of W by P, where W is the nominal wage and P is the price level. On the other hand, workers are imperfectly informed, so labor supply is based on expected real wage. That is, we can write down LS as a function of W upon PE, where PE, as explained earlier, is expected price level. Now, this can be further written as LS is equal to a function of W by P into P upon PE. So, we have divided by P and also multiplied by P. Now, that is, we can see workers know their nominal wage, but cannot correctly tell the aggregate price level. Now, clearly, if wages and prices rise in the same proportion, the real wage is unchanged. So, workers should not put in more effort and increase their supply of labor. However, let us say there is imperfect information and the worker, they believe that only wages have risen and not the price level. That is, our PE is less than P, and therefore mistakenly infers that real wages have risen. Consequently, the worker supplies more labor, thereby increasing output. Thus, when price level deviates from the expected price, output deviates from the natural rate. You can draw the relevant labor demand and labor supply curves with real wage on the vertical axis and employment on the horizontal axis, and verify the fact that when P is greater than PE, there is a shift in the labor supply curve. Let's now consider the second case of imperfect information. Here it is assumed that all wages and prices are flexible, yet output can deviate from the natural rate if there are misperceptions about the price level. When prices of all goods and factors are rising in the economy, producers tend to confuse it with the rise in the relative price of the commodity which they produce, as they cannot observe or monitor the price rise of the numerous commodities produced in the market. Now, suppose price of all goods and services are rising in the economy. A producer producing commodity X observes that the price of X is rising, but cannot clearly tell if the price of all other commodities are rising alongside, as she cannot keep a track of the price trends of all the other commodities. Is it possible? No, it is not possible to keep a track of all the price trends. So, if she mistakenly infers that the relative price of X has increased, she would work hard and produce more. I am sure you agree with that. If she is able to know correctly that there is no change in relative price, she would not increase production. Typically, she would think that either of the two is likely to happen and would compromise by producing more, but not as much as she would have if the relative price of X had actually increased. Now, this leads to a deviation of output from the natural rate when prices changes are inadequately perceived. Let us now try to understand and move on to the types of aggregate supply. Understanding the nature of aggregate supply and aggregate demand is important. as the intersection of the two, as we have learned, gives us the equilibrium price and output. Moreover, a shift in either the AS or AD, you will learn more about this shift in the AD curve in our next module. You will find, however, that it can give rise to economic fluctuations. There are three types of AS curves. On one extreme, we have the Keynesian AS curve, which is horizontal, depicting the short run. At the other extreme, we have the classical AS curve, which is vertical and depicts the long run. Between these two cases, we have the typically upward sloping AS curve, which we have studied in our section above, and which depicts the intermediate range. Let us look at the first extreme, which is the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. The Keynesian aggregate supply curve depicts the short run when input and product prices are assumed to be fixed. This may arise when firms have printed price catalogs and it is costly for them to print new ones if a situation so arises. This makes prices sticky in the face of changing demand. When aggregate demand increases, it leads to an increase in real output as the economy is assumed to be operating at less than full capacity. Figure shows the Keynesian AS, which is horizontal at the given price level P0. As AD shifts from AD0 to AD1, which we have been saying again and again, you will learn separately, the real GDP increases, as you can observe, from Y0 to Y1, and Y1 is greater than Y0 without any increase in the price level. So in the diagram, the price level remains same, the AD curve has moved and the output level has increased from Y0 to Y1, and as I mentioned and I have repeated, and let me repeat once again, Y1 is greater than Y0. Let us now move on to the second other extreme, which is classical aggregate supply curve. The economy is assumed to be at the long run level with output fixed at the level of full employment of existing resources. Now, the same amount of goods and services will be produced irrespective of what the price level is. So, as the economy is operating at an efficient point on the production possibility frontier, there is no scope for increasing real GDP by employing resources at their normal utilization levels. Here, an increase in demand will be inflationary. We can see that in our diagram, where the AS is vertical at the full employment level of output, defined as Yn. A shift of AD from AD0 to AD1 in this case increases the price level from P0 to P1, and we will understand more about this process when it is discussed in detail in our next module. But the diagram is quite clear that the output level remains same at Yn, but the price level has increased from P0 to P1. This is our classical aggregate supply curve. Let us now discuss and try to understand the AS in intermediate range in our section 4.3. In general, prices are neither fully flexible nor entirely sticky, and economies usually operate below the potential level of output. In the intermediate range, AS curve is upward sloping, and expansion in the demand would lead to an increase in the price level as well as an increase in the real GDP. We would see that in this figure, where again AD shifts from AD0 to AD1. But now we can observe that price level increases from P0 to P1 and output increases from Y0 to Y1. This is the difference between the intermediate range and the other ranges. So this will continue till the economy reaches the full employment output at Yn, and therefore the intermediate range falls between point A and point B. And we can draw the diagram more clearly, because here it is going to be upward sloping, but after B it could be a vertical line, and below A it could be an horizontal line also. Let us now try to look at the alternative view of the short run and the long run in this section. First, we will discuss about the short run aggregate supply, which we have defined as SRAS. Now, instead of assuming prices to be inflexible, the SRAS can also show a direct relationship between changes in prices and output. We can rewrite the supply curve equation of 3 above as P is equal to PE plus let us say alpha into Y minus Yn. Now, deduct this last period P minus 1 from both sides to get P minus 1 equal to PE minus P minus 1 plus alpha into Y minus Yn. Further, if we divide both sides of the equation by P minus 1 upon P minus 1 equal to PE minus P minus 1 upon P minus 1 plus alpha into Y minus Yn upon P minus 1. Since inflation is the rate of change of prices, the SRAS curve equivalently shows the relationship between the rate of inflation and real output. Therefore, this SRAS equation can be written as pi equal to pi raised to power e or pi e plus epsilon y minus yn, where pi and pi e are actual and expected inflation rate respectively, and epsilon equals alpha upon p minus 1, which is the responsiveness of inflation to changes in output. In figures, we are showing on a given SRAS expected inflation pi e is held constant. At lower levels of output, the SRAS is relatively flat and output can be easily increased as resources are operating below full capacity. But as we move closer to full employment, SRAS becomes steeper. So this is our diagram where we have output on the x-axis and inflation on the y-axis, which is denoted by pi, and SRAS is upward sloping. Let's now discuss the long run aggregate supply curve in this section 5.2. The long run average supply curve is vertical at full employment level of output as described earlier, and in figure LRAS comprises all points such that expected inflation is equal to actual inflation, indicating long run equilibrium. In other words, when pi equals pi e, y is at y end, yn, and is independent of the rate of inflation. So in this diagram, we have LRAS, which is vertical at yn, and inflation as usual is on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. So our long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical supply curve. Let's now talk about the shift of aggregate supply. First, again we will talk about shift of short run aggregate supply. The short run aggregate supply shifts mainly due to the following reasons. It could be a rise in expected inflation. So SRAS shifts in response to a shift in aggregate demand curve. Here we introduce a new version of the old aggregate demand curve to signify the inverse relationship between inflation and output in an economy, instead of the original AD, which shows an inverse relationship between price level P and output. So in figure it shows a shift of AD to the right leads to a temporary increase in output to Y1 as we move from point E to E prime. Since the output now exceeds the full employment output, wages start rising, which leads to an increase in the rate of inflation to pi 1. Since actual inflation is now greater than expected inflation, that is pi 1 is greater than pi e, people will revise and increase their expectations of inflation, and SRAS will shift upward till we reach point E double prime, where expected inflation and actual inflation are again equal, and economy is back to that full employment level of output, which is our most important objective. So figure shows how we may have shift of the AD curve as well as the shift of the SRAS curve, and ultimately we remain at Yn. Let's now introduce the supply shock. The SRAS can shift due to supply shock. If price of raw materials such as oil increases, it will affect prices and therefore inflation across the board. The SRAS will shift upwards, implying that each level of output now corresponds to a higher rate of inflation, as shown in figure, and we can very clearly look at this diagram. Now this has a negative impact on the economy as output falls below the potential level and inflation increases, and therefore it is called an adverse supply shock. Point E prime shows stagflation with high inflation and high unemployment. So both are high, inflation as well as unemployment. A favorable supply shock, on the other hand, will lower the SRAS. So in figure you can very clearly see that we have a downward sloping AD curve, we have SRAS upward sloping, the curve shifts up, and both the output level and the inflation level in this case increases. Now let us look at the shift of LRAS, long run aggregate supply curve. The long run aggregate supply curve depicts the level of real output in the long run when all resources are being used at their optimal level, and expected inflation equals actual inflation. Changes in the price level do not affect the long run level of output. The position of the full employment output can be shifted to the right when resources increase. For example, more labor is now available due to growth of population or migration, etc. Or alternatively, the existing resources are utilized through an improvement in the quality of the resources. For example, again, maybe workers improve their skill through proper education and training or due to technological improvements. So there could be very many reasons for improving the quality of the resources. This figure shows how the shift in LRAS moves the level of potential output from Yn to Yn prime. The shift in LRAS is gradual and long term. So we have a shift of the LRAS from LRAS to LRAS prime, and the equilibrium level of output shifts from Yn to Yn prime. And as we see, we have the inflation on the y-axis. So I hope all of you are clear on how these curves may shift. So let us now try to summarize what we have learned in this module. Aggregate supply and aggregate demand, they determine the equilibrium level of output and price. The shape of the AS is important in this context. I am sure you would agree. We have also learned how the AS typically sloped upwards, indicating a positive relationship between price level and output. It is drawn for a given level of expected price. If the expected price level increases, the AS shifts upward. We have also learned that given stick in nominal wage, an increase in price level causes real wage to fall, thereby increasing the demand for labor, which results in more production, thus establishing a direct relationship between P and Y. We have also seen that how, when all prices are flexible, the positive relationship between P and Y can be explained, assuming that producers have a misperception about the price level and they confuse overall price changes as relative price changes. I am sure you would recall we have also discussed that the AS curve has three distinct shapes signifying three ranges. The Keynesian AS is flat at a fixed price level and output adjusts to changes in demand. The classical aggregate supply is vertical at full employment output and prices adjust in response to changes in demand, And finally, the intermediate range when AS slopes upwards, which is our intermediate range between the Keynesian and the classical range. The short-run aggregate supply curve shows the positive relationship between inflation and output, holding expected rate of inflation constant. We have discussed that the long-run aggregate supply shows the long-run situation when output is at the natural rate and it is independent of the inflation rate. You would also recall how we discussed that SRAS shifts when expected rate of inflation changes or when a supply shock hits the economy. Finally, we have also learned that how LRAS shifts when supply side factors such as technology changes or resources expand.